Hi everyone. This week's topic is the God as archetype. And we will look over throughout the course at 4 key archetypes. And we will examine 2 of those archetypes today: the Supreme Being and the Great Goddess. Now, it's first important for us to consider the meaning of the word archetype. Many of you may be already familiar with it. It has its roots in the theories of C.G. Jung, a Swiss psychologist who coined the term archetype. And it's come to stand for a recurrent symbol, image, or story pattern that exists across cultures, and, C.G. Jung theorized, is a product of our collective unconscious minds. Jung argued, and I'm sure I have mentioned this before, that as human beings, we have very similar fears, anxieties, concerns, and desires. Jung argued that these anxieties are mirrored in our stories, and in particular myth, because they are products of our collective unconscious minds. So when we refer to an archetype, we're referring to a set story pattern or a set character that is familiar to us when we see it. What this does for us is it establishes patterns in stories, and it also, on some levels, brings us a degree of comfort. Because as soon as we come into contact with this story pattern or set character, for example, we know what to expect. There's an element of familiarity for us, and that brings us comfort. So, Leeming has a few comments to make about archetypes themselves. He argues that we derive the form from divinity from our own experience. So he argues that we make gods in our own image. Now, we often hear the reverse, right? That we are made in the image of God or gods. But Leeming says that all we know is our own experience. And we can't know the gods. We can only know our own experience of them. So we make gods in our own image, and this marks or reflects the physical limitations of our being. We are attached to our bodies. We identify with them in connection to our identity, yes. We see ourselves as connected to these bodies as who we are. And so Leeming says, well, this is our limitation. Because we exist within these physical bodies, we can't really imagine what gods and goddesses might look like. So we create set images, set stories for them. And these are, in essence, archetypes. So we see a set pattern of archetypes and motifs across cultures, not just within specific cultures, yes, and across human existence. Some examples of set characters or figures, set archetypes, are the Father Creator, the Great Mother, the Trickster, the Dying God, the Destroyer God, the Helper God, the primordial sky-earth male-female pair, the gods who visit the earth and then are shunned, and so on and so forth. Yes. So on page 17, Leeming says, it is important to recognize in any god or goddess both the mask or metaphor that is worshipped by the culture that created it, and the spiritual or psychological source of that mask, the archetype. which is either an aspect of ultimate reality or creation of what Jung calls the collective unconscious, the collective human mind. So Leeming is arguing here, this is on page 117, if I didn't mention that already. Leeming is arguing here that we should consider two key aspects of any god or goddess and of any archetype. Yes? What we see, so what's external, and perhaps the surface image or the symbol that's connected to that god or goddess as we see them in the kind of exterior world. And then the internal understanding of the god and goddess, which is behind the mask, yes? Which is perhaps symbolic of our fears, our concerns, and our anxieties. And so we need to consider the metaphorical representation of each god and goddess, as well as the way that they are represented to us materially or externally. Okay, we need to consider them in two ways. This aspect of mythology, because it is rooted in psychology, I think really heavily reflects the symbolic nature of myth. And so it is the case that when we're reading stories, we need to consider them outside of human terms and consider them instead as concepts and symbols that are reflected in the stories that we tell. So when we come to the Supreme Being, this is the first archetype that we're examining. Leeming argues that the Supreme Being embodies the patriarchal arrangement of society. He embodies kingship and male power. The word Dios, or God, actually comes from the Sanskrit root div, which means shine, light, or day. So the Supreme Being is often associated with these things. He is often a sun god, a giver of life, heat, and light. But he is also seen as unapproachable. And so if we consider the sun, for example, in itself, we can connect with the sun in that we feel its warmth and we experience its light. But we can't touch the sun. Yes, the sun is far removed from us. It's inaccessible. And so this is our image of the Supreme Being. The same kind of feeling that he or she is there, but is remote, removed, and inaccessible to us. As Leeming says, we cannot know the god or gods, right? They're removed. So the Supreme Being really reflects this idea. Okay, the Supreme Being is often the creator or the originator of the universe and is often associated with the bull. This is because bulls are seen as very virile creatures, very fertile creatures, very strong, very masculine. Okay, and so we can look to examples like Zeus or Indra, Thor, or even the Sumerian Enlil for these kinds of associations. Sometimes the Supreme Being is the husband of the Great Earth Mother, and he is associated with the weather or the sky, as she is associated with the earth, and we'll come to her in just a moment. Now, sometimes it is true that the Supreme Being is female, but it's not as common. We do have several examples in our textbook, including Amaterasu from Japan, the Native North American Cherokee sun goddess as well. But as I say, female representations of the Supreme Being are not as common as male representations. The sky home of the Supreme Being is usually associated with the law. In particular, higher law and higher values. The Supreme Being in this case, like Yahweh or God in the Christian tradition, Allah, or the Persian Ahura Mazda even, are seen as lawgivers, law preservers, and law maintainers of the laws that they've created. We may also have supreme beings who are seen as the ultimate reality or presented as the ultimate reality. The Hindu Brahman is a good example of this. Shiva, Vishnu, the goddess Devi, Brahma are all metaphors for Brahman, who is seen as the ultimate reality and the ultimate God. Also, the ultimate oneness. Everything and nothing. Yes? Brahman is seen as the absolute reality out of which all life forms flow. Okay? Now we have an example in Leeming of Krishna Vishnu as Brahman, and it's on page 119. In this example from the textbook, we have a section in which Krishna gives Arjuna a celestial eye. And I think it's good to take a moment to give this excerpt a little bit of context. So for those who are not familiar with Indian philosophy, I think it's nice to take a look at where this section comes from. And for that, I rely a little bit on Eknath Easwaran's text, which is called Essence of the Bhagavad-Gita, a contemporary guide to yoga, meditation, and Indian philosophy. And in it, he gives us a very brief description at the outset of the background of the Bhagavad-Gita. That text is a small section of a larger text called the Mahabharata. And in it, we come to meet the warrior prince Arjuna as he is faced with a conflict and a conundrum, a decision that he needs to make. The Bhagavad-Gita is a very famous text from Indian philosophy, and it is used as the essence and the root, I would say, for most of the Indian traditions, Indian spiritual traditions. So when the Bhagavad-Gita begins, we find Arjuna standing between opposing armies on the eve of Armageddon. And he seeks guidance from his immortal teacher, Krishna, or Sri Krishna, as he is referred to, who is really an avatar for Brahman, the absolute reality. In human form, yes. The Bhagavad-Gita is a dialogue between the two, and when they have several discussions about Arjuna's conundrum and how he should proceed, but also about life, the nature of life and death, and our existence in the universe. Arjuna turns to Sri Krishna because he's confused about how he should act. And then what Sri Krishna does is he presents the highest wisdom to Arjuna, and then he leaves it for him to decide. So he gives him the greatest spiritual understanding, and then he says, now it's up to you. Often when we discuss spiritual traditions in India, we use the term Hinduism, but Eknath Easwaran argues that this is too narrow a term. Instead, he argues that we should use the term Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana means changeless or eternal, and Dharma means the law or the eternal principles on which life is based. So we can consider the Bhagavad-Gita and its teachings as part of an explanation of Sanatana Dharma. In it, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna what practices to follow to gain direct experiential knowledge of reality. And then he shows it to him through the celestial eye, which is the excerpt in your textbook. The paths to this wisdom are called yoga, and the underlying theory is called Sankhya. So the Bhagavad-Gita appears in the 6th book of the Mahabharata, an immense epic which tells the story of the struggle between two rival branches of the same dynasty, the Pandavas, 5 brothers, and the Kauravas, their cousins. Despite the Pandavas' attempts to preserve peace, the Kauravas have insisted on war. So the Gita begins on the morning before the battle, when Arjuna, one of the Pandavas, instructs his charioteer, Sri Krishna, to drive the chariot into the open field between the opposing armies. When Arjuna gets there, he's faced with seeing his friends, his family, his teachers, all preparing to destroy each other in war. And Arjuna throws down his bow and he says, I can't continue. I can't go on. I can't do this. Then we have a pause in the story while there is an exchange between Arjuna and Sri Krishna. And it is instruction on the teachings of life and death. For example, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that the enemies he must conquer are lust, fear, and anger. It's because of things like this that the Mahatma Gandhi argued that the Gita was an allegory for our own inner battles of good and evil, right and wrong. The central message of the Bhagavad-Gita is that life is an indivisible whole, oneness. So we cannot have peace without unity and harmony. So this is just a little bit of the context for that section on page 119 of the Gita, in which Krishna gives Arjuna the celestial eye, or spiritual understanding. And then also we read about Krishna's transfiguration as well. That excerpt comes from a much larger text, which discusses the essence of life and death, and gives us a practical understanding of how we can proceed. As I mentioned, Arjuna is given the knowledge, but he's not told what to do with it. That is up to him. And again, this is part of the essence of the Bhagavad-Gita as well. In this case, as I mentioned, Krishna is just an avatar for Brahman, who is the absolute and ultimate reality, and fits with the Supreme Being archetype. Our second archetype that we are considering is called the Great Goddess. She's really often seen as the counterpart of the Supreme Being. And just as the Supreme Being is often seen as a sky god, a weather god, a god that is up high and inaccessible, the Great Goddess is seen as an earth goddess, usually. So she is grounded firmly in the earth. The Great Goddess is connected to the Great Mother archetype, primarily the Earth Mother archetype. She is the personification of Earth itself, and she's associated with nourishment and creation. Now, earliest images of goddess-like figures appear in human culture in cave paintings, rock carvings, and small statues from the Upper Paleolithic period. So this is 30,000 to 7,000 BCE. It's a really long time ago. Many of these images focus on the goddess as an earth mother and a bringer of life. So she's very connected to fertility. Many are inscribed with markings that signify lunar months as well. And so there is always an inference or an implication of a cycle. She's often connected, as I mentioned before, to a supreme being. So an equal or dominant mate, depending on the culture, who is the representation of the sky. So we have this connection or this marriage between sky and earth, as we've seen in some of the creation myths that we examined. Heaven and earth then become the primal couple who are united in an act of creation, right? So we had Papa and Rangi in the Maori myth. We have Sun God and Spider Woman among the Hopi, Izanagi and Izanami among the Japanese, Geb and Nut for ancient Egyptians, although the situation is reversed, yes. The gender or energy, I would say, is reversed. I think energy is a more accurate term than gender for much of mythology, actually. We're just talking about energies here. Or the Earth Mother is worshipped as the source of life, and out of her body comes nourishment capable of giving new birth to objects that seem dead as well. So just as she can bring new life, she can also bring about rebirth. This fits too with a cycle of agriculture, yes, and crops, in that the Earth Mother doesn't just bring corn one year, for example, or the great goddess, right? She brings it every year. So there are the seeds of last year's corn in the ground, and then it comes up again. With the advent of agriculture, as I mentioned that, the Earth Mother came to sometimes displace, in a way, or replace the great goddess. So the great goddess kind of morphed into this, from this more global perspective on nourishment and life, and moved into a position as a goddess of agriculture as well, and fertility, planting, and harvesting. We see this in Demeter, the Greek goddess. We see it Devi in the Indian goddess, and Isis in Egypt, and also in Inanna Ishtar in Mesopotamia. Sometimes the great goddess is seen as representing mysteries of all kinds. So they could be mysteries of the unconscious mind. They could be mysteries associated with death. Often they are connected with cults of worship that have to do with loss of loved ones, resurrection, destruction, war as well. So it's not possible to say that the great goddess is only a life giver. Sometimes she can also be a destroyer. And these two forces are often complemented or reflected in her representation. So in the East, for example, in Indian traditions, the great goddess remains somewhat ambiguous. In the goddess Devi, we can also see the goddess Kali or Durga. So we see this possibility or tendency to create and give life, but also to destroy or to be destructive. If things are destroyed by a great goddess, it's because they need to be for life to move forward. The destruction itself is not arbitrary or pointless. It's purposeful. It's so that life can continue and move on. So she's associated with the cycle of death and rebirth. Sort of an understanding of the mysteries of the unconscious before it emerges into wholeness, and the cyclical nature of all of this. She's often connected with the moon and the moon cycles, as I mentioned before. So we have many examples of great goddesses in our textbook, including the Native North American or Inuit goddess Sedna. We have White Buffalo Woman from the Lakota Sioux tradition. We also have Devi from the Indian tradition. And we have Danudan from Ireland and Wales. So there are many examples of goddesses signifying the great goddess archetype or fulfilling the great goddess archetype. And what's interesting for us is that we can look at the complement that happens, that we can look at the ways in which the supreme being and the great goddess complement each other. Apologies.